Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio, radio, no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you're driving along in your car or in your truck, or put in those earbuds on public transport. In this essay, I want to talk about the masses of propaganda going around about how wonderful globalization is because it promotes free trade, it lifts people out of poverty, it creates wealth, it creates jobs. It's just a win all round. I just want to sort of clarify this because that is total bullshit. You're being fed the most outrageous propaganda here, and I want to go through the main headings, if you like, of this propaganda and just dispel these myths that are being constantly pushed by the globalist propaganda machine. Now, I'm reasonably well qualified to comment, having been in international business for quite some time and traveled the world many times over on business, and having had to make these so-called trade deals and understanding the mechanics and the intricacies of how they actually do work on the ground. So let's go through some of this now. Number one is free trade. Does it actually exist? So the free movement of goods and supposedly services. Now the globalists sort of take on this that they're a little bit some more discreet about mentioning is the free movement of people, as in cheap labor and capital, particularly cheap peasant labor and capital, and the reduction of sovereign nations. So free trade, as they see it, is to create multinational and transnational economic zones. So there's no such thing as sovereign nations. But when you have no such thing as sovereign nations, you have no such thing as a sovereign people or a sovereign government. So whilst you say there's no, while they would say, well, there's no such thing as a nation that isn't tied up in free trade. What they're really saying is that there's no such thing as sovereign nations or sovereign governments. And if there's no such thing as sovereign governments, then democracy by default cannot exist, because you cannot vote for a government that has no sovereign powers, and within a nation that has no sovereignty. So we need to understand what the globalists mean, and the additional sort of knock-on interpretations of what free trade is. Now, the reality of free trade is that there are different countries with different competitive advantages and different circumstances and different capacities and capabilities. For example, Singapore has no natural resources, and yet they're able to, not a large population, and yet they're able to be quite a wealthy country. Now, some of this is because of they're perfectly positioned on a major trade route, which means they can handle all sorts of services, and in terms of, say, hospitality, hotels, freight handling, passenger handling, as in a major international airport hub, and those sorts of ancillary services. That they also do quite a bit of value add engineering, and I've done some over the years, done some very good business in Singapore, and on balance, they're a well-educated, commercially savvy sort of people, particularly the Chinese, less so the Indians, but certainly the Chinese. And I've always looked forward to going there and doing business, and I've always found it to be worthwhile and dealing with sensible, serious people and so on. So Singapore, there is in effect the ingenuity of their people. A lot of this you could sort of trace back to not just Chinese work ethic and so on, but the Lee Kuan Yew, or when the British were in Singapore, he called himself Harry Lee, but Lee Kuan Yew, and the foundations, both political, economic, and organisational, that Lee Kuan Yew championed, were very much part of that success story, which continues today. The very first time I went to Singapore, it was just really coming out of the sort of a stopover place, a lot of swampland and so on, and not really much in the area of high rise, and still a lot of old Chinese sort of merchant type shops around the place, but it changed quite quickly. From the first time I went there to even a decade later, the change and the development was quite extraordinary. Anyway, this idea of free trade. Australia has, for example, lots of minerals such as coal and iron ore and bauxite, and the list goes on, that are quite close to the surface and can be mined quite economically. It's not like in some of the coal fields in Europe where you've got to almost dig down 100 miles before you find anything, in as much as it's been previously exhausted. So different countries have different strengths. Some have vast areas of agricultural land. Others have good quality soil, others less. So others have to subsidize domestic producers, such as the way, say, the Japanese government might subsidize rice growing in Japan, and the way Indian government subsidize various agricultural undertakings in India. So each country has different capacities and strengths and different internal sort of lobby groups and so on that can exercise influence over officials at whatever level. And this is something the globalists want to get away from. But this idea that completely free trade exists is a nonsense. Insofar as the advanced economies have a much higher standard of living and a much higher wage, much higher tax base. Third world countries have at least a lower collectible tax base, and much lower wages, and so on. So when the two trade together, it can't be free trade, given the huge disparity between the organizational, technical, taxation, and governmental and so on infrastructure there. So that the trade cannot be free, in as much as that there's so much difference between the two. Now, when you get to advanced Western countries, or countries of approximately the same standard of living and same, give or take, same legal system, then free trade can exist insofar as each country will try and capitalize on what it does best. Because in two equal partners, one will say, well, look, you guys are really good at, say in the case of trading with Germany, you guys are really good at making advanced technical equipment like, machine tools, things like that. So we'll buy your machine tools, but we're really good at making, or doing something else. We're good at growing, having lots of cheese and champagne. So you buy our cheese and champagne, we'll buy your machine tools. So you can get a meeting there. So two equal economies will work out what each does best, and then they'll trade along those lines. And that trade typically works very well. But when you get two very different economies coming together, then the trade can't be free, as each one will the advanced economy will seek to protect the wages of its citizens, and why not? The poor economy will have to engage in selling its agricultural products in return for value-add products such as machine tools or motor vehicles. So that creates a large disparity. So the trade's not free, as each participating trade partner attempts to protect its own situation, given the unequal nature. So we need to understand that about free trade. We need to understand that in third world countries, the only export they have of any value, that as from a globalist perspective, is their cheap labour, is their peasant, their surplus population, their surplus workforce. That's the only asset that they have. Now, in order to use that asset, the globalists have to destroy the Western economies by diluting standard of living and so on, which of course is gathering a pace there. And if we look at the purchasing power of the paycheck in the Western countries in 1970 and the purchasing power of that paycheck today, the purchasing power has fallen by something like 70%, if not more, over that time. So anyway, that's that side of free trade. We need to keep free trade in perspective. Exporting your surplus population of illiterate peasants, I would argue, is not free trade, but the globalists argue that it is. So that ideological sort of position that the globalists take, I don't agree for a moment. That is free trade, nor could it ever be viewed as much. Okay, the next The next one is booming trade. That is, since free trade, since globalization began, they would argue free trade or booming international trade. Look at the numbers. Look at the figures here. I mean, trade's 3 times higher than it was a decade ago or 2 decades ago, and I haven't got the exact numbers in front of me, but the argument is, and they've got the numbers to throw around to prove it. Trade has the amount of international trade has boomed. That's because of free trade. That's because it's a good thing. That's why it's so fantastic. That's all bullshit. Absolute bullshit. There's been in supply chain type international trade. There are so many items now and value of goods that are moved again and then moved once more, and they can be moved around internationally from place to place 3 or 4 times, but it's counted as a net transaction each time, or an additional transaction each time. But it's not. It's one lot of stuff being moved 4 times, but they're counting it 4 times rather than saying, look, it's one lot of things being moved around. That's not an increase in trade. That's just one lump of shit being moved 4 times. But they count that 4 times and say, look at the boom in trade. For example, say Australian fruit. I mean, I'll pick a few examples out, but Australian fruit is picked. But instead of processing it and canning it in Australia, it'll be sent offshore to some third world country or some third world place in Asia. I don't know, the Philippines, for example, Malaysia or somewhere. Or Malaysia's not really third world anymore. But so that fruit then has a value. It's $100 is exported to, I'll use round numbers, exported to the Philippines. The Philippines then processes the fruit, but it gets canned somewhere else. And so, or the labels are attached somewhere else. So that gets moved once to the Philippines, where the fruit is sort of peeled and processed. It then gets moved to the third location, for example, the third location to be put in cans. Now, the value of the cans is actually made in a 4th location and then moved to the location where the actual canning, where the fruit being put in the cans take place. So we've got 4, if not 5 moves altogether. Then the fruit is then exported back to Australia. So 4, 5, there are 6 moves in this, in terms of where the fruit is processed, where it's grown, where it's picked, where it's picked and grown, where it's processed, where it's canned, where the cans are made and delivered, and then it's moved back to Australia. So there's a lot of moves there, but each one is an additional transaction. Now, the way that used to happen, hitherto, was that in Australia, the fruit would be picked and processed here in Australia. It would be canned in Australia by cans made in Australia, by labels printed in Australia, and then distributed. So there was one transaction, one international transaction. But today, that same process can have 5 transactions. And it's this multiple counting of transactions which gives the illusion, and it is an illusion, of a huge booming international trade. The trade is I think it would be marginally bigger than it was. As more people, China as an example, are brought into the international trading network. So I do get that. But the idea that it's anywhere near the numbers that are being claimed is bullshit. Now, other examples can be, say, electronic products. So the semiconductors manufactured so and so, the printed circuit boards or whatever are manufactured somewhere else. The chassis for say a computer or a laptop or whatever computer, I don't know, it could be an iPhone or something, manufactured in another place, and they're all the screens are made somewhere. So these all have a value. Now, the international movement and the invoicing and the values that are used are outrageously and horribly abused by multinational corporations to minimize their tax. So they're fattening up certain invoices, skinning, making others skinny, so reducing or increasing the supposed value of what's being moved around, and then using that within various tax situations to minimize their tax. So there's that going on as well, which artificially inflates numbers in a way that don't reflect the value of the goods being moved. But when you look at the amount of components, where they're made, how they're made, where they're integrated, where they're assembled, where they're packaged, and so on. And again, there are multiple moves of really the same $100 just being moved many times. Whereas, all that stuff was at one time all made in Australia, or it was maybe all made in Taiwan, for example. And again, the multinational corporations, not unreasonably do this. It was cheaper to make this product or this component over there. These guys are specialized in that, so we'll use their components over here. But all these things move around, and again, they're counted multiple times, whereas it used to simply be one time, or it wouldn't be moved. It would all be made in America, for example. So this free trade thing and the booming international trade, we need to put this in perspective. When you actually take out this double, triple, quadruple, quintuple accounting of the same $100 being moved, of goods being moved multiple times, then you start to come back and you realize that the volume of world trade has increased, but nowhere near. So when the globalists crow about, look at this, world trade has increased tenfold and this sort of thing, that's bullshit, absolute bullshit, and you can dismiss it out of hand. Has world trade increased? Well, yeah, but not by that much. So, and we're paying for it by a reduction in Western living standards. So this hasn't solved a problem or created additional benefit. The price or the cost for this international globalization trade, the cost has been taken out of the pockets of middle class Western white people. So they haven't solved a problem or created a new frontier of profit. They've simply stolen money from one place and they've moved the problem around. That's all they've done, and that needs to be understood and realized. The last thing is I want to talk about here is people being lifted out of poverty. Now, again, this is a big globalist sort of ace that they like to play. Look at the hundreds of millions, billions of people have lifted out of poverty. Little girls who were dying in the street are now rich and driving, living in waterfront properties. And no, bullshit. Let's just call that bullshit. Have people been lifted out of poverty? Well, if they have, it's hardly any. And this is an accounting trick that the globalists and the internationalists use. Let me describe how it works. So you've got a peasant living in a farm, out in, I don't know, rural China or rural India or anywhere, like a third world country. They're living hand to mouth. It's subsistence peasants, but they're living primarily on barter, which you can't really put a value on. Hardly any of their transactions are identifiable or taxable. So these farmers, and they're not rich, they are living marginally above subsistence, but they will trade their eggs for the other farmers, I don't know, milk or something, and these guys will trade their fruit for that guy something else. And so barter is a very key part of how they live. Now, they live quite well. They live with their family. They own their own property. It'll be a simple property. Maybe they don't have flushing toilets or, electric lights or running water or something. Maybe they don't have those things. But whatever they have, they own. They're not paying anyone off. They're not paying a bank or renting something. And a lot of the things they own are for example, they might have, say, one tractor that's owned by the whole village, and they just take turns at using it for hauling stuff around or taking their produce to market or tilling the fields or whatever it might be. But so they have equipment, but it's communally owned, and they trade their surpluses for, say, oil and petroleum and maybe heating kerosene or something. So they're trading their stuff. Most of the things that they get around them are they live off the land to a large extent. And they kind of do okay. Now, they're not rich, and they're still living on the dirt floor hut type scenario. But again, they have no debt. They don't have an income in the sense that they're working for somebody because they're in effect self-employed. But a large, in quality of life terms, they've got access to, their wider family, and they've lived there for generations. Again, the barter. So if you added in the barter in terms of the the value of all their transactions, you'd see a very different case. Now, the World Bank or any of these globalist groups can say, well, these people only live on $1 a day. But that's only because they're not, they don't count the bartering, which could be $100 a day or whatever. Also, the cost of say your hens having eggs. You're not paying supermarket prices or grocery store prices for eggs. You're exchanging for something else. So that value or that added value of the battery, the hen battery farm, the packaging, transport to the grocery store, the retail profit margin, none of that exists there. So now if you move that person who's the barter, they live by barter and sharing and communal ownership. If you take that person from the subsistence farm existence and you put them into the city working for a multinational corporation, soldering, processor chips onto a circuit board or something, or just any paid wage job in the city, then you can say, well, they were only making $1 a day yesterday out in the subsistence farm. Now they're making, $10 a day or $20 a day. Look! Now we've lifted them out of poverty. Look at this: $1 to $20 a day. We've lifted them out of poverty. No, that's not what's happened. Once they move to the city on a wage, you can measure that wage. They're paid that wage, and that's measurable. But now they have to pay rent because they don't own the property, which they did own out in the rural area. They can't barter and exchange anything. They have to go to the store and buy it so you can record that transaction. And that's now a cost of living that they previously didn't have. And they have to work 12-hour days. They don't have any relatives around them or friends or the village. So their quality of life in terms of who they know and who's around, the quality of life declines quite substantially. And they're working 12-hour days, 6 days a week. And sure, they're getting a wage, and that gives the appearance, the apparition of that they're now, look how wealthy they are now. Look, hey, they're making so much more money. No, that doesn't factor into the overall equation here. Well, the globalists claim it does, and they claim, well, that person is now lifted out of poverty. That is not, that is a scam. That is a mathematical, arithmetic scam that they're using there. That person has not been lifted out of poverty. Instead, they're now getting a wage, and they have to pay for everything where they had to pay for nothing previously. And so the reality is they have I would argue, a lower standard of living and certainly a lower quality of life. Have they been lifted out of poverty? Not at all. Now, if they end up sort of becoming a captain of industry or something like that, as one in every few million might, then sure, they have been lifted out of poverty. They've seen opportunities and they've pursued them, or they've sucked up to the right Communist Party goons in China and they've got a break. There's those sort of situations, but very, very few, a tiny proportion, of people who are going to make that leap forward. So, or that great leap forward if it's China. So, but I just want to cover this idea that these people have been lifted out of poverty. They haven't been. They've just been moved from a barter subsistence existence on the farm into some shitty low-wage job, which can now be measured as an income. And then that is argued to say that they've been lifted out of poverty when, in fact, nothing of the sort has occurred. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.